The man who saved me from school bullying has lost his memory. My friend said how much he loved me before, but he sneered disdainfully and said, I was blind before. He remembers everyone except me. At the end of the corridor, two figures were there and I didn't know what they were talking about. The girl was holding his arm and gently swaying it coquettously. Suddenly, everything around me became blurry. All I could see were the gentle smile on Tanner's face and his arm that he didn't pull away. Then the girl stood on tiptoe and moved closer to his face. I calmly looked away and pushed open the door of the private room to go in. My heart was stabbed densely and painfully, and it was hard for me to breathe. Just as I sat down, the door was opened again. The man's face was cold and hard. He threw his coat aside and went straight to the bathroom. The girl who had been opposite him just now also followed in. With red eyes, she shouted loudly at the bathroom door, Tanner. What do you mean? It's okay if you pushed me away, but was I so disgusting to you? Did you have to pretend that you wanted to vomit right in front of me? The surroundings became quiet. I came back to my senses and in my mind appeared the scene not long ago under the hidden streetlight where Tanner was kissing me. The cautious yet passionate warmth was still fresh in my memory. A few minutes later, Tanner came out of the door with water on his face. He casually wiped the water droplets with a tissue and his smile was cold and indifferent. Sorry. It's a sequelae of being discharged from the hospital. I couldn't help it. The atmosphere was awkward. My friend who liked to watch the excitement said without hesitation, Wendy is still here. Although Tanner doesn't remember now. He loved her so much before. Of course. He would feel disgusted when he sees you now. As the voice fell, everyone's eyes fell on me, including Tanner's. Just as I was about to say something, the man's casual voice came to my ears. He said, I was blind before. Tanner lost his memory because he blocked a stick for me on the night when the college entrance examination ended. As fate played a trick, he remembered everyone except me. I understand why he is so resistant to me. He was originally a rebellious and bad-tempered person and he only restrained his edge after meeting me. Now everything has gone back to the way it was. Without music playing, every move of mine seemed abrupt. I'm leaving first, I said. Zach stopped me and tried to persuade me awkwardly. Don't take it to heart. When Anna recovers his memory, he will surely beg you with tears not to leave. Tanner was excellent in his studies, but he was fierce in fights and many people in the school were afraid of him. However, he was also a crybaby. Once I was beaten up by others and it was he who saved me. While wiping his tears, he disinfected my wounds. Everyone could see how good he was to me and how much he cared about me. But now, in this dim private room, the Tanner who loved me deeply in the eyes of others was playing with a wine glass and chatting and laughing with friends. His eyebrows and eyes were dark and he looked both aloof and flamboyant. Feeling my gaze, he lazily turned his eyes to glance at me for a moment. The indifference and blankness in his eyes made me suffocate for a moment. The background was filled with the feasting and revelry. After the college entrance examination, everyone was relaxing and having fun. Nobody noticed that I had left. I arrived at the milk tea shop where I worked part-time and got busy. The boss came over and teased me. Why hasn't your little boyfriend come to pick you up recently? I paused slightly in my actions and said, he's quite busy. Tanner didn't agree with me working part-time and even directly set up an intimate payment method for me. Later, unable to persuade me otherwise, he waited for me under the streetlight diagonally opposite every night, no matter how late it was. Whenever he saw me coming out, he would always gently hug me and ask me if I was tired, and his words were full of concern. After chatting for a few more sentences, the boss left first and I stayed to close the shop. At 10 o'clock in the evening, I had just tidied up the cashier counter and was about to turn off the lights when two boys came from not far away. Tanner, you said you always felt like there was something you hadn't done. So you just came to buy a cup of milk tea? The friend beside him winked at me and teased. When Tanner saw that I was there, he was obviously stunned for a moment. He was wearing a black t-shirt and his tone was emotionless with a frivolous smile. Can I still buy one? I thought he might have remembered something when he showed up here, but he hadn't at all. The man casually ordered a cup of milk tea and added, no sugar. I didn't say anything but just nodded. Our feeling filled my heart. Life was so bitter that I liked tall sweet things. At that time, Tanner learned to make cakes and snacks and would send me different kinds every day and accompany me to eat them. But it turned out that he didn't like sweet things. I turned sideways and made the milk tea on my own. Tanner leaned casually against the door frame like that with his dark eyes, looking at me. Several times. I was so flustered that I didn't know what to do next. Finally, petting so felt mad sorry. After packing it up, he took it but didn't hurry to leave. Tanner? I was stunned and said, "What?" I drank too much just now and spoke too harshly. "I'm sorry," he said. His tone was very solemn. Even though he had forgotten me, he was still an upright and magnanimous boy. "Did you remember anything?" I asked. Tanner shook his head and asked with a smile, "How did we meet?" After a moment of silence, I lowered my eyebrows and said in a low voice, "You told me to follow you. And then others wouldn't be able to hurt me." I would never forget that day. Tanner found me beside the damp trash can and without any disgust. He put his coat on me. I squatted on the ground and looked up, and the streetle-twide was behind him. From the dark night to the dawn. And from then on, it was bright. He said, "Wendy, follow me, head and so sell me. And they won't hurt you." After I finished speaking, Tanner sneered and reached into his pocket to take out a cigarette. For the first time in such a long time, I saw him smoking. The firelight flickered on and off, and the smoke dispersed, making his facial features look more three-dimensional and tough. I almost forgot that Tanner was the school hunk in No. 1 middle school. He and I didn't seem to match at all when we were together. "It seems that I was really attentive to you before," he said. He lazily flicked the cigarette ash and continued, "It's a pity that I don't remember it." The traffic on the roadside was blurry and the neon lights were flashing. I stared at his eyes, afraid of missing any changes in his expression. Actually, I was very self-abased. So self-abased that I kept rejecting Tanner's approach at first. I confessed everything recklessly. I said that I had no parents and my aunt and classmates were very mean to me. I said I was a jinx and that no one liked me. I remembered that he hugged me with red eyes like a poor little dog, burying his head in my neck and muffling his voice. He said, "I like you. Wendy. Don't drive me away." I dug my fingernails into the tabletop, suppressing the soreness and Stefan's ends in my nose bit by bit. I didn't know what I'd touched and I hissed in pain. The fingertip was pricked by a wood splinter. Before I could react, a warm hand covered my wrist. Across the bar counter, Tanner held my hand, and the worry in his eyes seemed to come instinctively. "Are you okay?" After saying that, he suddenly realized the awkwardness of the situation. He let go of my hand, awkwardly frowned irritably as if resisting this instinctive reaction. "I'm leaving." I rubbed my fingertip and suddenly asked, "Are we considered broken up?" Tanner nodded and didn't say anything. Zach, beside him, was obviously stunned. After all he had tried to persuade and hint to Tanner many times, both openly and secretly, during this period. "No, Tanner. You just agreed to break up like this? You'll regret it. Don't blame me for not stopping you." Tanner was a bit impatient. The sound of a car horn came from the street and his voice was clearly audible. "I really don't have that kind of feeling for her. At most, it's just pity." My eyelashes trembled slightly, and I wanted to say something with a choked voice, but my mind went blank. His figure had already walked away. I didn't take back my gaze for a long time. There was a layer of mist in front of my eyes. I raised my hand to touch it and it was tears. He used to be always afraid that I would be hurt. The stick that he blocked for me that day hit the back of his head right on. It must have been even more painful. So I don't blame him. His appearance in my life was already a blessing. I couldn't be greedy and think of staying with him for a lifetime. "Tanner, may you be safe and sound in the future." The days passed one by one. Recently I've always been having dreams. I dreamed that I was huddled in the corner of the rooftop and they were pouring unknown substances around me. Humiliation, absurdity, and decay filled all my senses bit by bit. When dinner arrived, he punched those people in the face like crazy. The scene was chaotic. Before he fell unconscious, he still asked me if I was injured. My vision became distorted and there were scenes that I had never seen before. There was a knife and blood droplets splashed on his cold and pale face. He hugged me and said gently in a soft voice, "Don't be afraid." But I was crying so sadly as if the grief from hell was sweeping over me. It wasn't until I opened my eyes and realized that it was a dream that I let out a sigh of relief. But my mood remained gloomy and depressed for a long time. As usual, I made breakfast for my aunt's family. I quietly went out to go to my part-time job. No one would give me living expenses or tuition fees, so I had to work hard to earn money during the summer vacation. The results of the college entrance examination were announced, and I was admitted to the Department of Finance at Nanjing University. I'm actually not good at math, but because Tanner chose science, I had to study day and night. Messages kept popping up in the class group saying that there would be a dinner gathering in the evening. Zach signed Tanner up for it. I stared at his name and somehow clicked into the chat box with him. We hadn't contacted each other for a long time. Scrolling up there were the messages he had sent me before. He said, "It will be cold tomorrow. Remember to wear the scarf, the one I knitted." He said, "I drank the water you sent today. We'll have to get married in the future." He said, "It's good that there's no holiday. I can see you every day." He said, "Wendy, shall we go to the same city to study in university together?" The passionate, straightforward, and high-spirited appearance of Tanner flashed through my mind one by one. I wanted to cry again. 77 I had 2 part-time jobs a day. I worked as a tutor during the day, and at the milk tea shop in the evening. During the dinner break I had 2 hours of free time. After hesitating again and again, I still went to the class dinner gathering. Before I reached the restaurant, I saw several people coming towards me. I stopped in my tracks, and my throat seemed to be choked by hands. It forced me to recall the countless times when they pushed my head into the sink. Mindy, the person who led the school bullying against me. She looked at me with her phoenix eyes, looking me up and down contemptuously from bottom to top. "I heard that Tanner has lost his memory." I neither nodded nor shook my head. Mindy's smile grew deeper, like a poisonous snake lurking in the deep grass. "You never know when it will jump up and bite you." I heard her sinister voice. "I'd like to see who will dare to protect you now. I still don't understand why I became the thorn in the side of these rich kids. Or maybe I do understand. There's no reason. The person holding the knife won't choose not to stab you just because you haven't done anything wrong." I also fought back and told the teacher, and then the teacher went to criticize them. After the criticism, those crazy people found me and became even more aggressive. Really having no one to turn to, I told my aunt, and my aunt said that flies don't bite seamless eggs. Mindy was right in what she just said. Except for Tanner, no one dared to protect me. No one wanted to offend these hooligans. He was like a safe haven. The world wouldn't favor me, but he would. Even though I tried my best to pretend to be calm, the fear and disgust from the bottom of my heart burst out in an instant. In the alley, I was forced to lean against the wall. I reached my hand behind my back and tremblingly pressed my phone. In the next second, it was snatched away directly. Someone controlled my arms. They were laughing, mocking, and cursing, calling me a bitch and a slut. Mindy pinched my face and sneered, "Wendy, did you miss us during this period?" I seemed to be deaf out of inertia and couldn't hear any sound. My fingernails were almost digging into my flesh, and a slap fell on my face without warning. The pain made my hair fall down, and I didn't even want to call for help. The arrogant voice in my heart kept roaring, "Coward, fight back. Kill them." But another timid voice told me, "Wendy, you've endured it for so many years. It will be okay when you go to university." I closed my eyes. At that moment, I probably wanted to escape from this world. "What are you doing?" The voice was cold. A tall and slender figure carrying a coat and a bottle of water in his hand slowly walked towards me. I slid down along the wall, looking at him against the light through my messy hair. It was Tanner. Every time it was him. The strength in his arm loose and a bit. Mindy was a bit stunned at first and then said casually, "I'm just chatting with a friend." "Does brother Tanner know him?" Tanner took a glance at me and chuckled for a moment. "Not familiar," he said. After that, there was a moment of silence. Mindy seemed to breathe a sigh of relief and looked at me with a raised eyebrow. I was wondering, how could brother Tanner know such an ugly duckling like you? In the next second, Tanner lifted his eyelids, his tone very light. "But I've called the police." Coming out of the police station, the evening wind made my eyes feel sore. I thought Tanner had already left. Under the street lamp, the man put out his cigarette and handed me something. It was a white bag containing iodine tincture and cotton swabs. My numb thoughts seemed to be yanked hard. I didn't cry in the alley, but now my eyes turned red. I found a bench and sat down. The blood at the corner of my mouth had dried. Without a mirror I could only use my phone screen to find the location of the wound. Tanner probably couldn't bear to watch anymore. He took the cotton swab and turned my face away. He frowned and sighed a bit. So stupid. I must have been out of my mind to have liked you before. His tone wasn't nice, but the action of helping me clean the wound was gentle. The wind was intertwined with our breaths. I smiled faintly and looked at his lowered eyebrows and eyes. Thank you for helping me. Tanner's movement paused slightly. He looked at me and said in a low voice, couldn't you fight back? Or couldn't you even ask for help? I let him put a band-aid on me, and my eyes became a bit misty. I had asked for help before. I had called the police, but all I got in return was even worse bullying. I lowered my head. My silence was my answer. Tanner looked at me for a few seconds and clicked his tongue. There are still 20 days until school starts. Come here for an hour every day. I looked up and a card was stuffed into my hand. It was a membership card for a taekwondo gym. I didn't know what kind of fluke mentality I had. Do you really have no memory of me at all? After a half-second of silence he shook his head. Probably afraid that I might misunderstand his abnormal behavior tonight, he casually explained. Don't misunderstand. I would help anyone in this situation. On the way back, I kept staring at this card. I didn't understand why I had agreed to go to learn taekwondo every day. Maybe it was because I wanted to protect myself and also see him more often. The door of my house was open and the voices of my aunt's family came from inside. If that dead girl gets beaten up a few more times a month, we can just lie around and make money in the future. It'll be enough to buy a house for our son. Don't say that. It's not just one house. The words were sparse, but each one was like a bomb exploding in my ears. I wouldn't turn 18 until the end of the month. Even if it went to the police station, as my guardian, my aunt would always agree to the private mediation proposed by the parents of those bullies. All just for money. My fingertips couldn't stop trembling. The little bit of warmth that had remained in my heart just now was completely gone. I walked past the living room silently. The voices of the couple on the sofa stopped for a moment, and then they continued as if nothing had happened. My aunt was cracking melon seeds, and rolled her eyes at me, saying in a nonchalant tone, "You live and eat at my place. You deserve to be beaten." With a bang I shut myself in my room. Leaning against the door panel I cried silently. I despised myself for being so timid and cowardly all the time. I imagined what it would be like if I fought back without caring about anything. But I was afraid of pain. I couldn't beat them. And I still wanted to see Tanner more often. Just get used to it. I'll leave this city in a little while. Just endure it. Accompanied by uncontrollable sobs, the rain outside hit the window with a dull sound. The sky will clear up eventually, right? The tutoring ended early. I arrived at the taekwondo gym at around 4 o'clock. Tanner wasn't there. I changed my clothes and didn't know what to do. I hesitated whether to send him a message or not. Classmate. You've tied your belt wrong. I subconsciously looked in the direction of the voice. It was a young and unfamiliar face. Judging from the outfit, he should be a certain trainee here. Sorry. It's my first time here, I said. He seemed to have seen many beginners like me. He took a step forward. Let me help you redo it. I opened my mouth to say something. Before I knew it, Tanner appeared behind me. He was wearing a white taekwondo uniform which couldn't hide the smooth and powerful muscle lines of his shoulders and neck. He walked up to me and looked coldly at the boy opposite. No. Thanks. I could sense the sudden hostility in the air. There were only the two of us left around. Tanner bent down slightly. In just a few seconds he tied it for me very standardly, but still had a cold face. Are you angry? I asked hesitantly. He didn't rush to reply. After a while he looked at me. Lick-spittle instinct. My eyes flickered slightly. I understood why he said that. After losing his memory, everyone told him how nice he had been to me before. Maybe subconsciously he thought that he had been a lick-spittle for me before, so he was even more repelled. That's not the case. I slowly shook my head. After a moment of silence, Tanner put on an uncaring look. Yesterday when you were injured. Even though I don't remember you, I still felt the pain along with you. What's that if not being a lick-spittle? He wasn't wrong. Once Mindy and the others took advantage of Tanner going to the teacher's office and blocked me on the school rooftop. That day I was alone and tried my best to protect myself, but my cheeks and arms were still injured. In the hospital, Tanner asked me with red eyes if it hurt. I smiled and said it didn't hurt at all at that time. He said, "Wendy, you don't have to be so strong in front of me. When you're hurt, I feel the pain too. I'm even biased towards you in my bones." People in the dark all hope to have a ray of light. But I had been in the dark for so long that hope had become a luxury. But I forgot that there's not only the sun that gives light, but also the moon. Now Tanner described all these as being a lickspittle. How could it be like that? I looked up at his black eyes. That's not the case. I liked you a lot too. He seemed to be stunned for a moment, and then looked away unnaturally with a casual smile on his lips. It's all in the past. Let me teach you a few moves. It turned out that I was really not that coordinated in my limbs. Tanner stood aside, folding his arms and frowning as he guided me. The movements of raising your knee and turning your body should be smooth. Don't be nervous. I took a deep breath and, following the skills he taught me at the beginning, lost my balance when turning around. In the instant I fell, I saw Tanner take a step forward. His warm palm pressed against my waist. His face was so close that my breath became disordered. In just a second, Tanner stepped back, frowning and muttering "stupid" under his breath. I rubbed my fingertips that had just touched each other. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the man's slightly red ears when he turned around. It was still early when it ended. On a midsummer evening, the neon lights were flickering. Tanner was standing at the street corner with a scarlet fingertip. He raised his hand and took a puff of the cigarette. The smoke rose like a scene in a movie, giving him a gloomy and hazy temperament. I walked closer. "I'm going to work part-time later. Are you hungry?" We almost spoke at the same time. We looked at each other in silence, and I nodded gently. Tanner put out the cigarette, found a trash can and threw it in. At the same time he grabbed my wrist. I came to my senses. I had almost been hit by a passing bicycle just now. "Girl, don't you watch where you're going?" It was a very familiar sentence. The old Tanner used to say this to me every time we crossed the road. I curved the corners of my mouth. The strength on my wrist increased for a moment. Tanner seemed to be in pain. He rubbed his eyebrows. "Do you have a headache?" I instinctively raised my hand to touch his forehead, but the man dodged it. He stood there for a moment before starting to walk again. "A bit dizzy." "It's okay." I didn't say anything. No matter how shameless it might seem, I had to admit that for a moment I really hoped that he would recover his memory. Selfishly, I wanted Tanner to love me again. There weren't many people in the restaurant. Tanner had just sat down. Unexpectedly, were into Zat and a few others, and ended up sharing a table. The boss came over and greeted Tanner. "I haven't seen you bring your girlfriend here for a long time. Both of you got into Nanjing University, right?" Zach's eyes lit up and he quickly said yes, that we were a perfect couple. Under the table, Tanner kicked Ak and the latter wisely shut his mouth. The boss said a few more words and left. Halfway through, Zach saw that I didn't eat much and thought I was too reserved. He casually pushed a plate of seafood in front of me. "Don't mind him. Brother Tanner has always been like this. Just wait for him to regret it." Before getting to know me, Tanner was indeed like that, cold and lazy. These friends were used to it. I shook my head, wanting to say something. Tanner turned his head and said, "She's allergic to seafood. Habits are scary. Even if you forget, your body and instincts still remember." The awkwardness was palpable. Tanner cursed under his breath and didn't say another word for the rest of the time. I looked at his side profile from time to time. His Adam's apple was prominent and his facial lines were sharp and three-dimensional. Tanner had always been good at science subjects. He was even among the top 10 in the city in physics and chemistry. He performed steadily in the college entrance examination and got into Nanjing University without a doubt. A person like him deserved to be liked by everyone and to live without any shadows. In the following days, I went to the taekwondo gym every day. Although I had no foundation at first, I did learn something. Sometimes Tanner guided me throughout the whole process, sometimes he only came for 10 minutes, and sometimes he didn't show up at all. All the classmates received their university admission notices. The head teacher organized the last meeting. Many parents of the students also went. I was alone. Watching everyone cry, I didn't feel much. I had never had my family's company, so no matter how warm the scene was, I couldn't empathize with them. Passing by the podium, I saw Tanner's parents talking to the teacher. I remembered them. Both of them were civil servants. When Tanner's head was injured and he was lying in the hospital bed after coming out of the operating room, I kept apologizing to them. Unexpectedly, instead of blaming me, they comforted me instead. It was the first time that I had experienced what it was like to be cared for by elders. All of this was given to me by Tanner. At the stairway entrance, I bumped into Mindy. Probably because there were many parents around today, she didn't bother me. When we passed by each other, she bumped my shoulder. I breathed a sigh of relief. Deep down, I was really afraid of them. They were like a group of kids. I didn't know where their bottom line was or whether they would ruin my whole life. Even now that I was like a walking corpse. Just as I walked to the school gate, Tanner was chatting and laughing with a few friends with a cigarette in his hand. Zach was sharp-eyed and called me over to chat for a few words. Standing beside Tanner, he was very tall. Even without any verbal communication, he made me feel a strong sense of security. A man moved a bit inside as if he was leaving a space for me, and not letting me get close to the middle of the road. These little details were enough to make me love this world. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw two people coming down the stairs not far away. They were Tanner's parents. I hesitated and stared at the cigarette, but between Tanner's fingers. Finally, I directly reached out, took it, and stubbed it out in the trash can. Tanner's fingertips twitched. He looked down in confusion and was about to say something. When did Zach learn to smoke? It's not good for your health, Tanner's father said. Then he nodded approvingly at Tanner. Zach was a bit shy and didn't even know where to put his cigarette. Uncle, I just learned. I'll quit right away. He stuttered, which brought a burst of laughter. Perhaps to thank me, Tanner surprisingly walked me home. There wasn't even a hint of the evening breeze along the way. Only my steps deliberately kept in sync with his. School starts next week. Will your family accompany you? He suddenly asked. I shook my head. I'll go to the station by myself. He lowered his eyes as if thinking about something. After a while he said, protect yourself. I stopped in my tracks, blinked slowly to relieve the soreness in my eyes, and said, thank you. Tanner sneered, are you already touched? You'll be easily deceived by men in the future. He was actually joking at a time like this. I forced a smile and felt a tiny bud sprouting in that withered place in my heart. Tanner, we should be okay in the future. Once we go to university and meet new people and things, we probably won't see each other often. I'm fine. He raised his eyebrows with a clean smile. I twisted my fingers and said again, it's my birthday this weekend. Can we meet? I lowered my head. We're still friends, aren't we? He looked at me for a moment and said, sure. What gift do you want? As we were talking, a group of hooligans came from across the street. I immediately saw the iron rods in their hands. The man standing in the front had a scar on his face. He narrowed his eyes, took a puff of a cigarette, and finally stamped it out under his foot, looking at me with a half smile, clearly coming with a purpose. I felt my breathing tighten as he stared at me. The sky turned gloomy as if it was going to rain in the next second. Tanner slowly took my wrist and pulled me behind him. He raised his eyelids and looked coldly at the opposite side. You've got the wrong person, he said. The scar-faced man laughed, and the scar looked even more hideous in the dim light. Mind your own business and get lost. Tanner glanced at me sideways as if signaling me to leave. I kept shaking my head. The hooligans on the opposite side clearly became impatient. With a wave of their hands, they rushed forward one after another. They swung their sticks at me in tacit agreement, but Tanner blocked them all. He had practiced taekwondo. Although he had the upper hand for a while, he couldn't withstand the siege of a group of people. I tremblingly took out my phone to call the police. The moment the call was connected, I saw someone stabbing with a knife. Tanner! I screamed, and tears welled up in my eyes. People were moving around and my vision was blocked. Then I saw the hooligan with the knife being kicked to the ground. Probably realizing that I was calling the police, the group of people ran away like dogs with their backs bent. The world became quiet. I rushed to his side in a panic. His hands were covered with blood and his mouth and forehead were also bruised, but I couldn't tell where the bleeding was coming from. Tanner casually wiped the back of his hand. It's not mine. Don't be afraid, he said. His voice was gentle, overlapping with the scene in my dream. Fortunately, it was a dream and he wasn't hurt. I felt a little relieved. The sky seemed to get darker. Blood droplets splashed on his cold and pale face. I wiped them off with tears in my eyes. I'm sorry, I said. Tanner smiled with a not too deep or to shallow dimple on his cheek. Wendy. I found that even though I've lost my memory, I'll still fall in love with you again. His tone was as light as the wind. I looked up in disbelief. The man rubbed the top of my head and said again, let's go. Where to? I didn't move and just kept looking at him. To your home, he said. I shook my head. I've already called the police. Can we go to the hospital to have a look first? He also shook his head. There was no emotion in his dark black eyes. Wendy. Let's go. I'll accompany you only up to this point. There were no neon lights or even passersby on the street. The surroundings were as dark as a curtain. I let the tears flow down my cheeks. Didn't you promise to accompany me on my birthday? It was like emotions gushing out like a devil forcing me to swallow a bowl of hot soup. I was afraid that I would never have another chance to say, you said we'd go to university together. You said you'd marry me. Tanner, for the last time, please, can you remember me? He slowly raised his hand as if helpless and hugged me. His fingertips were so cold that they were trembling. Marry someone else, he said. I shook my head sullenly, unwilling to do so. He smiled briefly. Can I give you the birthday wish in advance? I hugged him tighter as if afraid that he would disappear in the next second. Okay, I said. Tanner was silent and his voice was deep and hoarse. In the future, be safe and happy. Don't have insomnia. And never come back here again. I didn't want to come back to this city that had brought me so much suffering at all. However, I let go of him with my eyelashes wet with tears. What about you? I asked. He smiled gently. If you want, I'll always be by your side. Suddenly a streetlight lit up. It illuminated a small area under our feet. I heard the sound of police sirens and ambulances, and then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes again, I saw the white walls. The smell of disinfectant filled my nose. Zach pushed the door open. The man took off his coat, saw that I woke up and smiled. You fainted last night. How are you feeling now? I didn't have time to think too much. I lifted the quilt and was about to get out of bed. Which ward is Tanner in? I'll go and see him. As soon as I said that, the room was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. Zach walked up to me and placed my slippers properly. He seemed to have changed and his temperament had become much more mature. He said, Wendy, were you dreaming again? Tanner has been gone for almost 10 years. In the midsummer, when the college entrance examination ended, even though the guardians of both sides had already reached a mediation settlement, Mindy still harbored a grudge against me after getting out of the detention center. She didn't hesitate to spend money to hire people from the underworld to block me. Tanner was stabbed 3 times while protecting me and died after ineffective rescue efforts. Incidents such as school violence and evil forces caused a major public outcry in society. Mindy was just a child. She came from a wealthy family but was also the stupidest and most vicious. She could trample on my dignity, but she couldn't challenge the authority of the law. Once she violated the criminal law, there was no way to mediate. Reports about who was detained, who was sentenced to fixed-term imprisonment, and who was sentenced to death came one after another. And I just wanted to beg these people, could you please give Tanner back to me? Please, could you give Tanner back to me? The knife I saw in the dream was real, and the blood was real. I just didn't want to believe it. The Tanner who loved me so deeply died in the midsummer when he was 18. After that I spent countless springs, summers, autumns, and winters recalling him. Tanner was the only child in his family. After his death, his parents cried their eyes out. Whether they blamed me or not, I accepted it. I said that I would never come back to this city again, but I would come back to visit his parents every holiday. I think it's probably these emotional ties that keep me alive. After graduating from university, I found a job in a state-owned enterprise. Whenever I was free, I would go back to visit Tanner's father and mother. The living have to continue living. Tanner's mother seemed relieved and told me to find a good man to marry. Everyone seemed to gradually let go. I smiled and refused. Auntie, actually I married Tanner when I was 18. Regret is a prelude to the protagonist's rise in movies, but in life it's a poison that makes people sink. I've been dreaming about Tanner more and more often. If there's a day when I don't dream about him, I'll feel panicked, wondering if Tanner doesn't want me anymore. Later I continued to dream about him. Tanner would always be soft-hearted towards me. He couldn't bear to see me in pain or crying, so he often came to see me in my dreams. Missing someone is so painful. It's probably a subconscious behavior. In my dreams I kept looking for reasons why he didn't love me. I pictured the way he didn't love me, thinking that maybe I could give up like this. But in the end Tanner would always find various reasons to fall in love with me again. I couldn't tell the difference between reality and dreams. I only know that Tanner has always been by my side. I often go to the cemetery to visit him. The man in the photo is still handsome with a shallow dimple when he smiles. His skin is fair, making his lips look slightly pink. When we first got together I always asked him if he was wearing lipstick. The result was that he would stick to me and kiss me, pressing his nose against mine and telling me that he wasn't. People can never predict the value of a moment until that moment becomes a memory. I couldn't help laughing, and then I started crying while laughing. I slowly slid my fingertips across his cheek. Suddenly snowflakes began to fall in the sky. It was the first snow of the year. Tanner, I miss you so much. The workplace isn't always smooth. Besides, I still don't have many friends. I'm withdrawn and cold. When I didn't do a project well, the leader scolded me very harshly. Under pressure I would send messages to Tanner's chat box. I've been doing this for 10 years as if it were a routine. Whether it's good or bad, I just want to tell him every bit of my life. Staying up late and not eating on time have accumulated into stomach problems. Still, I have to endure the pain and go to work. One day, I complained pitifully to Tanner, warning him that I was in so much pain. Why didn't he care about me? I sent the message. There was no reply. But I could still imagine the man pretending to be fierce and pointing at my nose. He would say, "You stay up late and don't eat. What are you waiting for? Go to the pharmacy." Tanner, I miss you so much. I'm 32 years old this year. It's the 14th year since Tanner left. It's getting colder and colder. During the spring festival I visited Tanner's parents. Time spares no one. Both of them had fine wrinkles on their faces. "Wendy, come and have dinner," they said. The reunion dinner on the first day of the new year was a harmonious and happy occasion. After the meal, Tanner's mother suddenly took out a red envelope and gave it to me. She smiled and took my hand gently and kindly. "Although we've already regarded you as our daughter for a long time, if you're willing in the future, could you call us Mom and Dad? Then our old couple will feel like we had descendants. The gods are merciful and compassionate, but when we open our eyes it's like hell on earth. Everyone suffers and everything is illusory. But in this endless purgatory, there's still a bit of warmth." I tried my best to hold back the soreness in my nose, but tears still flowed down. It's said that crying on the first day of the new year is unlucky, but everyone's eyes were red. That day, for the first time since I could remember, I called out the words Mom and Dad. So this is what it feels like. I have a family now. It's still given to me by Tanner. Just when I was touched and secretly delighted about it, I never dreamed of Tanner again. In the last dream he was wearing his high school uniform, smiling at me and waving to me. He disappeared without even saying a word to me. I should be happy. Tanner finally left with peace of mind. However, my life gradually became depressed for no reason. I would stare blankly at a spot, burst into tears, inexplicably suffer from insomnia, and didn't want to eat, and even forget that I had to go to work that day. Zach took me to see a psychiatrist. A lot of medicine was prescribed. "Wendy, put your work aside for now and remember to take the medicine on time," he told me worriedly before leaving. I nodded with a smile. When I got home I started crying again. The confusion that the world brought to me was far more than the answers that I could give to the world. I would feel disgusted at everything I saw. I could even hold my head and cry bitterly just because the water was too hot when I drank it. I hated socializing, hated sleeping, and hated it when people came to comfort me. I didn't like this world at all. I had no idea how to live at all. Tanner, I miss you so much. Could you come to see me? When I really couldn't hold on any longer, I went back to see my mom and dad. When I saw them I had a little will to live. This was given to me by Tanner. I should cherish it well. Another year passed in a daze. I had lost a lot of weight. Zach couldn't bear to see me like this anymore. "Wendy, Tanner is dead. Do you understand? He won't come back. Do you understand? Cheer up and take a good look at the people around you. You have your parents and me. Everyone cares about you very much." I knew that I was probably sick. It was a very difficult illness to cure. I said with a smile, "I'm fine. Don't worry." The wind was very cold that late night. I walked out of the house alone and took a stroll to the seaside. Tanner, you said you would take me to see the sea. You said you would go to college with me and that you would marry me. You broke your promises. Before it was you who came to find me. Now you can't come back. This time could I go to find you instead? Do you think I'm very selfish for leaving our parents behind again? But Tanner, I have no choice. Don't blame me. I can't endure it anymore. I want to see you. But don't worry. I've saved some money and will give it to our parents. They won't suffer in their old age. By the way, I've also left a part for Zach. Your good brother has been taking care of me and our parents like family members for so many years. It's my way of repaying him. Something blocked my nose. My vision became blurred bit by bit. But there was no pain. My whole body felt relaxed. This road is so cold. Tanner, remember to pick me up. The end. On the day I found out that Zane had betrayed me, he told me quite calmly that he had fallen in love with someone else. And soon after we broke up, he publicly announced his relationship with that girl. I had witnessed them kissing sweetly. He promised her that they would get married after graduation. He had made the same promise to me before. Hello? Brother Song, is Zane in the dormitory? I called him but he didn't answer. Today was the 3rd anniversary of my relationship with Zane. I didn't tell him that I was coming. I originally wanted to surprise him. But after calling him for nearly half an hour and not getting through, I had no choice but to call his roommate. Ah, it's you, sister-in-law. Isn't Zane with you? I heard the front desk of the All Seasons Hotel calling him yesterday. I even asked him if you were coming over today, and he said yes. I was stunned for a moment. He said that Zane had left an hour ago and that I could just go directly to find him. After thanking him and hanging up the phone, I stood by the roadside for a long time before suppressing the suspicion that was creeping up in my heart. It wasn't that I was deceiving myself, but I really couldn't believe that Zane would cheat on me. I took a taxi and went straight to the All Seasons Hotel. Sitting in the car, I still felt inexplicably flustered. After arriving there, I negotiated with the front desk for a while before she told me Zane's room number. By the way, she also told me with a complicated look that he had come with a girl. Instantly, I felt as if I had fallen into an ice cellar. I nodded numbly and said, okay. The front desk didn't pay any more attention to me, but the last look she gave me was rather sympathetic. I sat on the sofa in the lobby. I didn't go upstairs to find him, nor did I call him again. I just sat there, doing nothing. I don't know how long it had passed, but dawn was gradually approaching. Among the people checking out one after another, I waited for Zane and that girl. I recognized her. She was a junior student who had once delivered water to Zane. Almost as soon as Zane walked into the lobby, he saw me. The look of satisfaction on his face hadn't even had time to fade away. Astrid. He froze on the spot and frowned as he looked at me. Looking at the person in front of me, I suddenly felt as if I didn't know him anymore. The Zane I knew, 5 years ago, when he saw the bruises on my body left by domestic violence, would hold me tightly, tell me not to be afraid, and tell me that he would take me away after graduation. 3 years ago, when taking graduation photos, he confessed his love to me with a red face. In the depths of winter 2 years ago, because he was worried about my injuries, he took a high-speed train and came to find me overnight. Even half a year ago, I was still nestled in his arms, fantasizing about the future and getting married together. During the 3 years we were together, he took meticulous care of me. Even though we were in different places, I had never lacked a sense of security. However, even such a good person as him could cheat on me. Zane and I were childhood sweethearts. We were in the same class from junior high school to high school. When we first met, my family hadn't fallen apart yet. Like him, I was just an ordinary student in an ordinary middle school. The difference was that he was already quite tall back then. In the second year of high school, my mother's affair was discovered by my father, and my parents got divorced. My mother gave up my custody. When my father went to work, he was no different from before, but after work, he would drink heavily and beat me. He pointed at my nose and scolded me, saying that I wasn't his biological child, grabbed my hair and banged my head against the wall, and glared at me furiously, telling me to go to hell. That day, I went to school with bruises on my head. Right after the first class ended, Zane pulled me to an empty corridor. "Who did this?" He stared intently at the bruise. I didn't want to tell him at first because I thought it was too embarrassing, so I touched my head and tried to make light of it, saying, "You mean this? I accidentally bumped into something at home last night." I then looked at him seriously and said, "It didn't affect my status as the most beautiful girl in the world, right? Stop joking." He frowned. "You accidentally bumped your head, but what about your arm?" Following his gaze, I saw my accidentally exposed arm, which was also covered with bruises. "Who hit you?" He took a step closer. I leaned weakly against the wall, turned my head to look out of the window, and said, "Zane, when will we graduate?" When the bell for the second class rang, Zane and I were sitting in the corner of the flag-raising platform. I was holding a can of cola and told him everything about my family in detail with my eyes downcast. He looked at me as if he was thinking about how he could help me. I smiled faintly and said, "Don't think about it, Zane. There's no way. In our place, the preference for sons over daughters is quite serious." Neither my uncle nor my aunt was willing to step in. "Then call the police." I shook my head. "These injuries are nothing. At most, the police will just give him a lecture." In the next second, I felt my wrist being tightly grasped by him. I knew that he was also powerless. His father had been missing since he was a child, and he was brought up by his mother alone, which wasn't easy. We didn't have any golden fingers at the start. We were just ordinary high school students from ordinary families with average academic performance. We might not even be considered ordinary. There was also a touch of sadness about us. I shrugged my shoulders easily, trying to ease the atmosphere, and said with a smile, "Actually, it's not always like this. He only gets violent when he drinks. Usually, he's quite normal." Astrid. I turned my head to meet Zane's gaze. There was a firmness of a teenager in the clear black eyes of the boy. He slowly bent over and hugged me, saying, "Don't be afraid. In a year, we'll both get into universities and other places together." In my ear was his voice, choked with suppressed sobs, "In another year, I'll take you away." His words were like a surging torrent, overflowing the dam that I had painstakingly built to resist the outside world, and instantly breaking through my emotional defenses. I buried my head in his shoulder and wept bitterly. I took Zane's words as the pillar of belief that supported me through that dark year. Throughout the whole senior year of high school, sometimes he pretended to come to my house to study with me, which helped me avoid several beatings. But it was just a few times. After all, having frequent contact with a boy would also become a new reason for me to be beaten. After struggling through that year, Zane told me that he couldn't go to other provinces with me. On the eve of the college entrance examination, his mother was diagnosed with chronic glomerulonephritis. To prevent it from worsening into uremia, he had to stay in our province to take care of her. When he told me about it, his tone was gloomy, and he didn't even dare to look up at me. Although I was disappointed, I wasn't angry because of it. I stood on tiptoe and flicked his forehead, deliberately saying with a smile, "If you can't go, then don't go. Why are you hanging your head like a dog?" Zane also looked at me and laughed, saying, "Are you looking for trouble?" I quickly ran away, making faces at him provocatively. We confessed our feelings to each other on the day of taking graduation photos. After everyone left, Zane and I wandered aimlessly on the playground. His school uniform was unbuttoned, and his hands were in the pockets of his school uniform pants, looking casual and a bit naughty. "Astrid." He suddenly stopped. I also stopped and turned to look at him, saying, The tall boy who was 1.87 meters suddenly seemed a bit shy. He stammered for a long time until his face turned red. There was still a thin layer of sweat on his forehead under the scorching sun. I vaguely guessed what he was going to say, so I quietly waited for him to speak and didn't rush him. Me too," I said with a curved lip. The flowing clouds drifted by. The sun was covered and then reappeared, and the sunlight once again fell on our shoulders. Suddenly, he wasn't nervous anymore and smiled silently. "I know," he said. Throughout the whole holiday, we were exploring this new thing called love. When we kissed for the first time, he was so nervous that he bit my lower lip. Hiss, he quickly pulled away, lowered his head to look at me, and asked, "Astrid, did I bite you?" Looking at his flustered appearance with his ears flushed red, I just found him cute. I covered my mouth to prevent him from seeing and said in a muffled voice, "Yes, it hurts a lot." Zane forcefully pulled my hand away, held my chin and lifted it up to look. Then he bent over and gently touched the wound, saying in a low voice, "I'm sorry." He kissed the wound gently again and again, apologizing for his recklessness. I felt as if my face was on fire, so I quickly buried it in his arms and refused to come out no matter what he said. His shyness was something I only saw in that summer night filled with the chirping of cicadas that year. Later, after we broke up, when he was with that junior student, he was like an old hand in love affairs, without any trace of his former self. Zane and I stared at each other for a long time, but he still held the junior student's arm and showed no intention of letting go. On the contrary, the junior student seemed a bit embarrassed. I quietly waited for Zane to check out. "Go back to school first." He patted the junior student's hand and said gently. I tightly clenched my hand hanging by my side. After leaving the hotel, we sat on a bench by the roadside. "We're not suitable for each other, Astrid." Looking at the red mark on his Adam's apple, I asked, "Did you just suddenly realize it after 3 years?" No matter how sad I was inside, I appeared extremely calm on the surface. Zane didn't like me anymore. Crying in front of him was meaningless. Besides making me seem noisy and clingy, it wouldn't do any good. I took a deep breath and calmly accused him, "Zane, it's not that we're not suitable anymore. It's that you've changed your heart. You've fallen in love with someone else." He looked ahead and tacitly accepted my explanation. Zane said, "Last year during the epidemic, you were trapped in Tianjin for more than 2 months. During that time, you were busy with your winter vacation job, and she was always by my side." I nodded and said, "Well, is this your reason for cheating?" He smiled with his head down and said, "Let me finish." He wasn't angry and continued to recall, "When I went home during the holiday, I just found out that her home was very close to mine. She would come to find me whenever she had nothing to do. My mother always told me that I couldn't let you worry and that I should keep a distance from her. I originally didn't have any feelings for her, but later." Zane told me that he had originally thought the epidemic situation in Tianjin had improved a bit and wanted to come to see me in Tianjin. But just as he arrived at the railway station, he received a call from the junior student, saying that his mother didn't know what was going on but suddenly had a severe pain in her waist and couldn't even stand up straight, and she was taking his mother to the hospital. He directly hailed a taxi and went to the hospital. The examination results showed that there was nothing serious, but if the junior student hadn't been there that day, he didn't know how long his mother would have suffered from the pain. "So you were touched?" I asked. He nodded and admitted, "Yes, but I fell in love with her later." Hearing this with my own ears, I felt a pang in my heart. It was as if a hand had suddenly clenched my heart tightly. It hurt, and at the same time, I could hardly breathe. Zane continued talking to himself. "That night, lying on the accompanying bed in the hospital, I thought that we were really not suitable for each other." He turned his head to look at me and said, "Astrid, both of us have suffered too much. If we stay together, we'll suffer even more in the future. I can't give you better conditions." It was the cliched excuse that scumbags often use when breaking up. He said it very seriously, but it still couldn't change the fact that he had cheated on me. I could hardly maintain my calmness and asked coldly, "Then you could have broken up with me at that time, but you chose to cheat on me behind my back." He smiled self-deprecatingly and said, "Maybe it's because..." He paused for a moment. "I couldn't bear to part with you." I heard his sobbing voice. "Astrid, even now, I think I still like you." The morning breeze in midsummer made me feel cold from the outside to the inside. I thought it was the strange weather playing tricks. The air fell silent. I didn't respond to his distorted psychological confession. He admitted his liking for her after sleeping with someone else, and then said he couldn't bear to part with me. He wanted me to understand that deep affection didn't mean being exclusive. But without talking about being exclusive, what right did he have to talk about deep affection? Zayn got up and interrupted my trance. He looked in the direction of the school and said, "I'm going back. You should also go back to Tianjin." He added, "It's still a bit chilly. You can find a milk tea shop and stay there for a while first. Now, I can't put my coat over you. It's not appropriate." I forced a smile, got up and distanced myself from him. You know, because my mother had an affair, I was indirectly hurt a lot. I hate affairs the most. His eyes dimmed a little. I said the last sentence to him, "Now that you've had an affair, our breakup isn't amicable. Zayn, don't ever show up in front of me again. Because you've let me down." I walked around him and left. I didn't hear his footsteps as he left, nor did I look back. The sun gradually got warmer. I was glad it wasn't a rainy day today, and a warm feeling gradually spread over my body. I hailed a taxi by the roadside and went straight to the railway station. The radio in the taxi happened to be playing Myth of the Star and Moon. Jean Shaw's voice came out through the electric current. If we had been brave enough to be together back then, would the ending be different? I opened the window and let the wind blow in. The wind was so strong that my eyes couldn't hold back the tears. I sniffed and casually wiped away the tears that had fallen. The driver timely handed me a box of tissues from the front seat and tactfully remained silent. I opened the window to its widest and let the wind howl in, drowning out my sobs. No, the ending wouldn't be different. If we hadn't been together back then, I think the only difference would be that I wouldn't be sadder than I am now. In my opinion, the most suffocating thing in one's life isn't missing out on something, nor is it parting forever due to death, but having something wonderful once and then losing it not because of any external factors, but simply because it has deteriorated. It has become rotten and beyond redemption. If I weren't such a prideful person, maybe I would have asked Zayn today, "Do you still remember what you said?" He once told me, and everyone else, with the most passionate and sincere heart that he would marry me. After the college entrance examination, I finally went to study in Tianjin, 1,000 kilometers away from Zayn. However, the long distance didn't seem to become an obstacle between us. We made video calls every day and met during holidays. He joined the basketball club at his school and became even more dazzling. When I was in high school, I watched him play basketball from the spectator seats and knew that he was really good at it and often dominated the whole court. Back then, there were junior schoolgirls giving him water, and it was no different in college. But I had never worried about Zayn. During the National Day holiday, he bought me a plane ticket and asked me to go to him. I knew that he probably couldn't get away and had to take time to accompany his mother to the hospital for examinations. The money he occasionally earned from part-time jobs was always used to buy me plane tickets. I refused several times, but he just ignored my refusals. Later, during one of our video calls, I seriously asked him to refund the ticket. He slowly exhaled a puff of smoke on the phone, lowered his eyes and tugged at his lips, warning, "Don't keep nagging." Then his voice dropped, "I can't bear to let you take the train for such a long time." I knew he was doing his best to be nice to me, so I stopped refusing. But he was very thrifty. The few times he came to see me, he basically took the hard seat on the train. When we arrived at his school, he held my hand and walked around everywhere. When he met acquaintances, he would generously introduce me, "This is my girlfriend." At night, he took me to treat his roommates to dinner. One of them got drunk and started making wild and teasing remarks. "When are you two planning to get married?" I opened my mouth, wanting to say that we had been together for less than half a year. But Zayn spoke up first, "We'll definitely let you know when we set the date." After the dinner, Zayn walked me back to the hotel. Remembering what he had said, I casually asked him, "What date were you talking about just now?" He had drunk a lot and his thoughts were a bit slow. Hearing my voice, he slowly blinked his eyes. "Huh?" His eyes were full of confusion. I swallowed and didn't expect him to have such a cute side. I cleared my throat and repeated the question. Finally, he understood. His eyes, filled with drunkenness, looked extremely serious. He said word by word, "The date of our wedding." I was so charmed by his straightforward words that I pretended not to care and snorted softly, then turned around and walked away, leaving him behind. He quickly caught up with me like a big dog afraid of being abandoned and forcibly held my hand. I turned my head away and didn't look at him, but I didn't let go of his hand either. When we reached downstairs of the hotel, he stopped on his own initiative. "Go to bed early, Astrid." I looked at his still dazed eyes and suddenly took a step closer to him, stood on tiptoe and whispered in his ear, "Classmate Zane, do you want to come upstairs with me?" Admittedly, I was just joking. I didn't have the courage to do it really. Unexpectedly, his reaction was so intense. Zane suddenly took several steps back, shook his head and refused righteously, "No, I won't. I can't go." I looked at his attitude of avoiding me as if I were something dangerous and my mind went blank. Did he dislike me? I looked at him and asked, "What do you mean?" He didn't notice my abnormality and said seriously, "We can't do that before getting married." I was stunned. He was even more conservative than I was. "Why?" I asked. "Because I have to be responsible for you." Zane really did as he said and didn't touch me before we got married. But at that time, I never expected that he would sleep with someone else later. The first Cold War between Zane and me happened in the second semester of our freshman year. There was a municipal oral English competition in our college, but there was only one quota. I was competing with another girl. Our scores were similar, but the instructor finally chose her. The reason was that she had higher club credits, which proved that she was more lively and had stronger adaptability. It was the first time I had heard such a far-fetched reason. Ignoring the instructor's awkward explanation, I nodded at her and turned around to leave. On my way back to the dormitory, I received a call from the boss of the store where I worked part-time. He said that I didn't need to go there anymore. It was the off-season and he could manage by himself without hiring anyone. I hung up the phone and it seemed that the anger suppressed in my heart became even stronger. I dialed Zane's number, wanting to hear his voice and his comfort. But unfortunately, he didn't answer. I put my phone back in my pocket and went straight back to the dormitory. I buried myself in sleep and was woken up by 2 notification sounds on my phone. I unlocked it in a daze and clicked on WeChat. It was a photo sent by Zane's roommate. "Sister-in-law, Comrade Zane isn't honest. He's accepting water from other girls behind your back." In an instant, the irritability that had been building up in me all day reached its peak. In the photo, Zane was wearing a basketball jersey, and a girl with a sweet smile was standing in front of him, handing him water. A few minutes later, his roommate sent another message, "Astrid, I was just joking. Zane didn't take the water from her." I glanced at it and didn't reply. I sat on the bed, lost in thought, feeling extremely irritable but having no energy to do anything. The sound of rain outside pulled me back to my senses. I remembered the bed sheet I had hung out to dry and quickly got out of bed to take it in. I stepped on the steps by the balcony to take down the bed sheet. When I came down, I subconsciously turned around, but my right leg didn't follow. Immediately after that, I heard a crisp sound of bones dislocating. My right kneecap suddenly caved in. I turned around in pain, and it then popped back into place. "Ah!" I cried out in pain, thinking that my bone was fractured. My roommates hadn't come back yet. I didn't dare to move, so I had to stand bent over, supporting myself on one leg. At this moment, I finally couldn't help crying out. Everything that happened within a day seemed to be against me. Nothing was going smoothly. Fortunately, my roommates came back quickly. They dropped their bags and helped me go to the hospital. Zane called when I had finished taking the X-ray and was sitting in the hospital corridor waiting for the results. I looked at the caller ID on the screen for a long time. A few seconds before it automatically hung up, I raised my hand and answered the call. "Astrid, I played basketball all afternoon today. I put my phone in my bag and didn't hear you call." "Oh," I replied. His tone became cautious. "Brother Song told me that he sent you that photo." Are you angry? I tapped my leg unconsciously with my fingers and said casually, no. I didn't take her water. Zane carefully explained, I told her right away that I had a girlfriend and asked her not to give me water anymore in the future. That's good, I said. My roommate came over, shook the bag in his hand and said, the X-ray results are out. Let's go into the consulting room. I nodded. Zane paused and asked, where are you? I slowly stood up, my voice carrying the pain I was suppressing. I'm in the hospital. Let's talk later. As soon as I finished speaking, I hung up the phone and walked into the consulting room with my roommate's support. There was nothing serious. It was just a ligament injury, but it still needed to be taken care of for more than half a month. On the way back, I ignored the dozen or so missed calls from Zane and only sent him a brief WeChat message. Astrid, are you injured? Yes. Zane didn't send any more messages, and I didn't wait for them either. After an emotional breakdown, all that was left was exhaustion. Nothing could stir my emotions anymore. Almost as soon as I got back to the dormitory, I immediately fell onto the bed and slept soundly. Probably because I went to bed too early, I woke up in a daze at around 4 o'clock in the morning. Zane had sent a WeChat message. I blinked my eyes, getting used to the light while looking at it. Astrid, I'm downstairs at your dormitory. Come down when you wake up. I'll take you to have breakfast. I quickly checked the time. The message was sent half an hour ago. I was instantly wide awake. I gritted my teeth, dragged my swollen leg and quietly went out and downstairs. Through the glass of the laundry room on the first floor, I saw Zane. In the early dawn of early April, it was still bone-chillingly cold. But he was only wearing a thin windbreaker, the kind of clothes suitable for our province. When he saw me limping towards him, his face immediately darkened. I opened the window and faced him across the protective railing. What's going on? How did you get here? We both spoke at the same time. Zane paused and then asked again. I sat on the windowsill and told him what had happened. After that, he asked me to roll up my trouser leg to show him. He frowned as he looked at the swollen area and said with pursed lips, does it hurt a lot? I nodded and said, it hurts terribly. He was about to say something else, but I interrupted him first. I'll go and ask the dormitory supervisor auntie to open the door for me. Zane nodded, and his frown didn't ease. I used my swollen leg as an excuse with the dormitory supervisor auntie, and then she let me out. As soon as I got out, I was held in Zane's arms. I was standing on a step one level higher than him, and half of my face just happened to be buried in his shoulder. There was a strong chill on his body. Obviously, he had been frozen quite badly. But even so, he hadn't thought of waking me up. I'm sorry, his tone was a bit heavy and full of guilt. I hid in his arms and rubbed against him, whispering, I forgive you. He had taken a 6-hour high-speed train ride to come to me overnight. I wouldn't hold on to trifles anymore. At this time, even the commercial streets outside hadn't opened yet. Not wanting him to be frozen like this any longer, Zane carried me on his back to the nearest hotel to have a rest. When I leaned on his back, the ginkgo trees on the side were slowly moving backwards. My restless heart seemed to finally find a place to settle down and was no longer just superficially calm. The light at the edge of the sky, the dim yellow street lamps, the silent dawn, and Zane and I. At that moment, I was really looking forward to our future more than ever. Zane came in a hurry and left in a hurry too. He had no fewer classes than I did, but he still came to find me without hesitation. I recalled all the bits and pieces of the past. So, even during the time when there was the epidemic in Tianjin as he mentioned and the junior female student was by his side wholeheartedly devoting herself, I didn't suspect that he had someone else. Because, apart from the reduced frequency of video chats, he hardly changed at all. He still cared about everything about me, worried about whether I had worn my mask properly, whether I had been exploited by the leaders, and would buy things for me from time to time. But now when I think about it, everything he did was no longer because of love but because of guilt. He was sorry for his change of heart and infidelity and was paving the way for his cheating. After I returned to school, it happened to be my roommate Luna's birthday. That night, I dragged her to drink a lot, and finally I burst into tears in her arms. My heart felt as if it was being crushed back and forth. It hurt so much that I didn't know what to do. I could only tightly clutch that piece of clothing, trying to relieve the pain. In the dead of night, I fell into a deep sleep. Finally, in the depths of my dream, I saw Zane when we were teenagers. He was wearing the high school uniform, with his coat still open, and had a somewhat ruffian smile. But that was also the last time I dreamed of him. For a long time after that, I didn't have any energy to do anything, and I was quite perfunctory in class. I had always thought that I was good at pretending that nothing had happened. In fact, my roommates just didn't expose me. All three of them were carefully safeguarding my insignificant dignity. In the later stage of junior year, the courses became more and more intensive. The school was afraid that the epidemic would break out again, so it planned to finish the courses 2 weeks earlier. Among the mountain of papers and exams, I didn't have time to be muddled anymore. Until after the exams were over, my roommates had already started to prepare for the postgraduate entrance examination and chose not to go home. I also had nowhere to go, so I stayed at school too. On New Year's Day in 2022, I wrapped myself up thickly and sat in a corner of the playground. I put my hands together, and the words I spoke came out as white puffs of air. In the new year, Astrid will live a serious life and become better and better. Also, I must forget him. But ironically, a few days after New Year's Day, the hospital in my hometown called me. My father was hospitalized due to alcohol poisoning caused by excessive drinking, and I had to go back to have a look. When I went home to get my father's documents, I saw Zane and the junior female student from a distance. Under the bare elm tree, he was kissing her. I stood quietly, and suddenly felt that having such good eyesight that I didn't need to wear glasses wasn't a good thing. Zane's kissing skills had become proficient now, and the junior female student was blushing and forced to accept it. After the kiss ended, I didn't know what Zane whispered, which made the junior female student shyly hit him. The two of them walked towards me while talking. I was at a loss for a moment, and then put the big hood of my down jacket on my head. Coupled with the mask covering the lower half of my face, I lowered my head, and others could hardly see my face. When Zane led the petite junior female student over, I pretended to be looking at moments. And indeed, they didn't notice me. When we passed by each other, I didn't glance to the side at all. In my ears were the voices of the two of them. Zane, you promised me that we'll get the marriage certificate when I graduate. Zane smiled, and his voice was full of indulgence. Okay. I walked at the same speed as usual, like a stranger who didn't know them. Just then, a piece of news popped up on my phone. I stared at the screen without blinking, but didn't take in any of the content. I didn't know how far I had walked. I gradually stopped until I couldn't hear their footsteps anymore. Moments had an update at this time, and I subconsciously pulled down to refresh. It was a screenshot of Zane's roommate complaining in the dormitory group. After Zane went home for the holiday, he hadn't said a word in the group. The caption also had a bit of a teasing meaning. Once you have a wife, you forget your roommates. Sure enough, it's plastic brotherhood. Of course, if I don't have to give money as a gift when you get married, then forget what I said. When I clicked on it again, this moment's post couldn't be seen anymore. It seldom snowed here even in the coldest days of winter. I looked up at the suddenly falling snowflakes and couldn't help but be surprised. I turned off my phone screen and put it in my bag, sniffed my nose. So it's this cold this year. I should come back less often in the future. I stamped my numb feet and then left as if nothing had happened, leaving the snowflakes falling all over the place behind me. After everything was taken care of, I immediately bought a ticket back to Tianjin. Again, I was sitting in a taxi on the way to the railway station. The standard equipment was an old-fashioned car radio. It was a morning when the snow was starting to melt. The sun hadn't come out yet, and it was so cold that the driver couldn't help but turn the heating to the maximum. On the radio, the host was reading a letter written by an anonymous girl to her ex-boyfriend who was about to get married with great emotion. When reading to the end, the host sighed regretfully. This is the 11th year since we met, the 11th year that I've loved you, but also the 4th year since we broke up. After years, I no longer dwell on the reason why you left me back then. Now, I can calmly send you my best wishes on your wedding. I think you're the villain who left me and ran away first, but at the same time, you're also my shining youth. I rested my chin on my hand boredly and looked out of the window. I don't know how long it took before I regained my thoughts. Zane, I thought silently, I've let it go. When the first warm sunlight shone on the snow, the remaining snow melted, and I drove into the spring light.